We have about 50 people that are in so far, and I assume that some people will still be trickling in as we get our speakers all set. So I'm just going to spotlight as soon as I figure out how to do this.
I think you already did.
Yeah, I'm just trying to add everyone. So today we are doing the first PYRN seminar series of our term, and we have 3 great speakers today that I'm excited to hear from, and hopefully all of you are as well. So today we're going to have, first we'll be hearing from Josephine Waltz, who will be talking about year-round CO2 flux partitioning, and she does her work out of Abisko, Sweden. Second, we'll hear from Sebastian Pereira from the Central Andes, who is a PhD candidate, talking about frozen ground and landscape evolution in the Central Andes, so some mountain permafrost. And finally, we'll hear from Mishélle Wehbe, looking at rock glaciers in Banff National Park in Canada. And Mishélle is a Masters of Science candidate at the University of Lethbridge. And my apologies, Josephine, I forgot to introduce you as a postdoc in Abisko, Sweden. So we'll have about 12 minutes for each of the speakers, and we'll have some time for questions after each of them. And then at the end, there will also be some time for general discussion. We have some people monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions for the speakers at any time, you can feel free to post them in there. And we can read them out for you, or after the presentation, you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. The only thing is we do ask that you keep your microphone muted while the speakers are giving their talks, just to reduce any background noise. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I will let Josephine begin her talk.
All right. Hello. So I want to talk about the postdoc work I do here in Abisko in northern Sweden. And it's year-round CO2 flux partitioning from Can you hear me? Yes, okay.
Yep,
from snow-covered Arctic ecosystems. So before I came to Sweden, I was working at the University of Hamburg together with Avi Potsdam in Germany. And then I worked on soil organic matter decomposition in Siberian permafrost, mostly the Lena River Delta and some Jedoma deposits on the New Siberian Islands. But now I work on winter processes at Umeå University, but I actually live in Abisko. And I want to take this opportunity also to acknowledge my colleagues. So I work with Frederica, who's another postdoc in our group, and Emil, a PhD candidate, and we all have our own projects, but we worked on the same sites. So we always helped each other out in the field. So what do we know about Arctic ecosystems and CO2? In the summertime, a lot of Arctic ecosystems take up more CO2 from the atmosphere than they respire. So CO2 is coming in through photosynthesis, and CO2 is coming out because it is respired by both plants and by soil microbes. What we don't really know is how much CO2 is coming out in winter. And what we also don't know, and that is true for summer and to some extent in summer, but definitely for winter, is where is the CO2 coming from? Is it coming from plant respiration or is it coming from soil respiration? And why do we need to know? Well, on the one hand, I mean, the Arctic winter is long. So if you have 8 months of winter and there's a steady CO2 production, does it then mean that on the annual scale, Arctic ecosystems release more CO2 than they take up, so they become a source of CO2? And then also, the partitioning of the CO2 flux, I mean, is it coming from plants or soil? It's quite an important distinction, because if it's coming from plants, then that is CO2 that the plant has taken up in last summer or maybe the summer before. So if that CO2 is released back to the atmosphere, it doesn't really add to atmospheric CO2 concentrations. But if it's coming from soil, then that is CO2 that has been sequestered in soils 100 to thousands to several thousand years ago. So if that is the main source of the CO2 that's coming out from Arctic ecosystems, that adds now to the atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And then why focus on winter at all? Snow is a very good insulator. So if you have a snow-covered ecosystem, air temperature can be very cold, but the soil temperature, where then most of the ecological processes, where the plants have its roots and where the soil microbes live, can be very favorable to CO2 production. So shown on this figure, we have on the one hand, we have the soil temperature over the winter period, and then that soil is covered in different snow thickness. So with the squares, we have only 10 centimeters of snow cover, and then we see that over the winter, the soil freezes down to -4, -6, -8 degrees. But if you add a meter of snow on top, then that soil doesn't get much colder than 0 degrees. And that's good conditions for plants or for the roots of the plants to continue to respire, and also for soil microbes to continue to respire CO2. So there has not been a lot of focus on ecological processes in winter, but looking at a figure like this, you would expect, okay, Arctic ecosystems, it's unlikely that they're going to be dormant in winter. So it is worth looking at them. So my research questions are, first, how much does ecosystem respiration in winter contribute to the annual CO2 exchange? And the second one, how much does plant and soil respiration contribute to ecosystem respiration in different seasons? So just a few terms so that we're all on the same page. So CO2 is going into the ecosystem via photosynthesis, and then the sum of it is called gross ecosystem production. By convention, it's always negative in at least my field. Other fields might define it the other way around, but here a negative CO2 flux means it's going from the atmosphere into the ecosystem. It can also be 0 if there is no photosynthesis. And then CO2 is coming out, that's ecosystem respiration. So that's always positive. So it's always going from the ecosystem back to the atmosphere. And ecosystem respiration is the sum of the autotrophic plant respiration from above ground and below ground plant parts, and the heterotrophic soil respiration. And then the sum of both of these processes is the net ecosystem exchange. So if net ecosystem exchange is smaller than 0, that means there is more CO2 going in than out. So the ecosystem is a sink for atmospheric CO2. If NEE is larger than 0, it means that more CO2 is coming out than going in. So the ecosystem is a source of CO2. We have 2 study sites up here in northern Sweden. So on this northern European map, the red dot is Abisko. It's several hundred kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. And then in Abisko, there's a research station, and then we have a field site close by. And then we have another field site in Mishélle. It's about a 40-kilometer drive. And there is a strong precipitation gradient between these 2 sites. So in Mishélle, we were expecting to have a lot more snow cover than in Abisko. And then at both sites, we looked for plots with a mixed heath vegetation. So we had a mixture of evergreens, of deciduous plants, and some graminoids. And then as for methods, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I'm happy to discuss if someone is interested at a later stage. So I'm measuring CO2 fluxes with a combination of transparent chambers, which allows me to measure NEE. So at the same time, I'm measuring how much CO2 is taken up and how much is released by respiration. And then I'm measuring with a dark chamber, so there's no light coming through, so I'm only measuring ecosystem respiration. And then the difference of these two chamber measurements will give me gross ecosystem production, so the CO2 uptake. To now partition ecosystem respiration into the two sources, I used two different methods. First, I used a clipping and trenching approach. So I had plots with vegetation, where I did a dark chamber measurement to measure ecosystem respiration. And then next to it, I had the plot where I removed all the plants and then did a dark chamber measurement on there. So I only measured the soil respiration. And then the difference between these two measurements will give me plant respiration, or autotrophic ARR, I called it here. And then a second method to partition ecosystem respiration into the two sources, I used an isotopic approach. So during the summer, I grew isotopically enriched plants. And then over the year, I measured both CO2 concentration as well as the isotopic signature. And then I used a method called Keeling plots to determine the isotopic signature in the field. And then in the lab, I determined the isotopic signature of the source signals and could then apply a two-pool mixing model to partition ecosystem respiration into its two sources. So as for results, just some environmental conditions to get started. So we have done the field experiment from the 1st of September 2019 to the 31st of August 2020, so 1 year. And then we have in blue Abisko, and in red we have Glaciers. At both sites, snow or continuous snow cover we had from about mid-October. And then snow accumulated over the winter. It was slightly higher in Glaciers than in Abisko as expected, but not as much as we were hoping for. So it's about a 20 centimeter difference in snow cover. Then we also measured PAR, so the photosynthetic active radiation. So that part of the radiation that the plants use to do photosynthesis. And that we measured at canopy height, so at the height where the plants receive. So in winter, all our PAR sensors were snowed in. We have, so once there is snow cover, there's basically no more sunlight reaching the plants. And then of course in winter from December to January, we have polar night. But then by March, April, there is sunlight, but it's not reaching the plants because they're still covered in 20, 30, 40 centimeters of snow. In Abisko, the snow disappeared in mid-April, and in Glaciers, the snow disappeared end of May. So also then, of course, in Abisko, PAR that reached the plants was measured about 6 weeks earlier than in Glaciers. And that's going to be important later on, because if the plants then have more time to do photosynthesis, so the CO2 that's going in. On the other side, we have air temperature at the top graph and then soil temperature at 5 centimeter soil depth in the lower graph. And air temperature between the two sites is not very different. But if you look at the soil temperature in autumn, and then in summer. In Abisko, so the blue line, it's always slightly higher. But then in winter, that switches around. Then in Glacier, so the red line, is always higher. And we expect that's due to the thicker snow cover at our Glacier site. And then we also see that if we check maybe here in November, we have already severe frost events, not too much snow yet, and that translates into the soil. So we have these dips in soil temperature. But then in Glacier, later in the winter, when we had a thick 50 or more centimeter snow cover, then we had in February days with minus 20, 25, minus 30 degrees. But in the soil, you see nothing of it because the snow insulated the soil. So in Glacier, the soil temperature stayed around 0 throughout the winter. And then in Glacier, the snow stayed until end of May. So the soil temperature also was still frozen, or not frozen, but 0 degrees until May. And then it was quite amazing that the last 50 centimeters of snow, they disappeared within 3 days. So one day there was 50 centimeters of snow, and then 3 days later there was nothing. And then by June, air temperature was already 20 degrees midday. And then from one day to the next, the soil temperatures in Glacier just skyrocketed from 0 to 10 degrees within 12 hours once the snow was gone. And that's, of course, then important for interpreting the ecosystem respiration data. Oh. So as for CO2 fluxes, we have again the two sites, Abisko and Glacier. In blue, we have ecosystem respiration, so it's always positive. And in pink, we have gross ecosystem production, so it's always negative. And then we see the peak for both is around midsummer, June, August. That's not very surprising. And then we see in winter, of course, there is no more photosynthesis. On the one hand, I mean, it's dark because there's no sunlight, and also it's dark at the plant level because they're covered in snow. But at both sides, we have low, but we have measurable ecosystem respiration throughout the winter at both sides. So we have small but measurable blue bars. And it's about 15% of what we measure in the summertime. If we now then sum ecosystem respiration and photosynthesis up, we get net ecosystem exchange. So as a reminder, when it's negative, the ecosystem is a sink. If it's positive, it's a source. So in the summer, as we had already known, most of the Arctic is a sink for CO2. But now if we add all these 8 months of winter, then it's a source during the winter, also not surprising because there's respiration, but no uptake. And if we now sum it up over the whole year, Abisko remained a small sink. So it did take up a lot of CO2 in the summer that could not make up for all the CO2 that was released in winter. But then the Glacier site on an annual time scale was no longer a sink, but became a source of CO2. If we now look at only ecosystem respiration, because that happens throughout the year, we can now, we're still deciding what do we define as winter and what do we define as summer. So I have for now defined winter from the 1st of October to the 31st of May. So that's 244 days. And then summer is the rest of the year, so 122 days. And if we now sum up all of the ecosystem respiration, then we have 80% of all the CO2 comes out in summer and 20% comes out in winter. It's a bit less on our second site in Glacier, but there is a steady contribution to the CO2 flux over the whole winter. But now the actual exciting thing is the source partitioning. So shown here is the contribution of plant respiration to ecosystem respiration over the whole year for both sides. And we see first, not a lot of difference over the year. And we see that it is around 50% at both sides. We see a similar pattern if we now add in blue the results from the isotopic partitioning. So we conclude that plant and soil respiration contribute equally to ecosystem respirations in all seasons. So to summarize, first question was how much CO2 is coming out in winter? So in winter, the production is a lot lower than in summer, but winter contributes 10 to 20% to the annual CO2 EcoFlux. The second question was, what is the main source? Mainly plants or mainly soil? So plant respiration contributes 40 to 50%, and there's little seasonal variation from summer to winter. We're still in the process of determining what the environmental drivers are, what the difference in snow cover means for the CO2 flux and for the soil characteristics. And then there's also the question of winter climatic change. So the climate in winter is changing a lot more in summer. So if we have more snow, does it mean we also have more CO2 production in winter? But we have more snow in winter, but it comes later and it melts earlier. So we have a longer growing season. Does that mean we take up more CO2? But if it melts or if it comes later and then we have autumn freezing events, does it then mean that the soil is not insulated as much? Do we then have less CO2? So what I want you to take home is that winter matters. And then thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josephine. That was very interesting. I do think that your final conclusion of winter matters is very important. I think that's something that's been historically overlooked in terms of CO2 flux and methane flux. So that was very, very interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions. We'll have to move on to the next speaker. But if you do have any questions for Josephine, please feel free to send a message to her privately in the chat, or you can also send it in the general chat, and that way everyone can add in their input as well. So thank you, Josephine. And if you can stop sharing your screen, our next speaker will be Sebastian, telling us about some mountain permafrost in the central Andes. So just let me change the spotlight here. So
Okay,
Sebastian, whenever you're ready. Yep, we sure can.
Okay, hello colleagues. I hope you're all fine. I'm going to talk about the frozen grounds and the landscape evolution in the Central Andes, which is kind of a very conceptual title, but I will explain why. So I do my PhD at the Geography Institute at the Catholic University of Chile. And so let's go. PYRN Chile is basically a very small group, and in general, we try to collaborate with people from Atacama University in the north and people that work in the central region from the Geography Institute, and we hope that more people are involved too. Okay, so my motivation is first to try to explain the different phenomena of the object of study, which is permafrost. And so the conditions of a changing context are different in the kind of impact as the previous presentation. It's not so much related to organic surfaces, but more or less related to this, to the fact that frozen grounds in the Andean region can be related to groundwater inputs, or at least related to their modification in terms of their hydrological residence. And so why is permafrost important here in the Andes? My personal opinion is that since it might be involved in the groundwater storage, it's also involved with complex fault systems at high altitudes, which is also related to mountain block recharge, which is even more complex. And to land this issue in the public sphere, it can aid or it can complicate land use policy strategies. Yeah. So the important thing is that in the context of atmospheric forcing, we can have certain groundwater storage volumes that are kind of resilient to the forcing, but these are all assumptions that need to be verified on baselines that we are trying to gather. So mostly the common thread between people from PYRN Chile is related to increase the resolution of mappings. And here to the left, you see some of the stuff that we have done. And it's basically to see that it's decreasing the assumed extent of permafrost in our mountains. And the importance here is that the resolution will give you enough data to parameterize hydrologically certain catchments and to deliver this kind of insights to modeling people and to try to do better planning. Okay, so this is kind of our motivation. Specifically in the Andes at 33 degrees south, that's where I do my fieldworks. It's a very complex setting, 3,600 meters of altitude. And the importance here, for example, is that my sites are within a conservation area surrounded by expanding mining operations, okay? And so this has been a very interesting story, but my task here is to try to understand how much time does it take for new water to infiltrate and to constitute part of the groundwater highway, and to try to establish certain volumes that we can estimate. All of this in the context of a region that has been declared water scarce since 2008. And importantly, because the snowpack is projected to decrease 40% in the next decade. And well, since it's a glacierized catchment, this is something that caught my attention as well, which is the likelihood of permafrost aggradation upon glacier retreat. And so many of the glacier foreland is actually in conditions that might be okay for permafrost aggradation. And this again will complicate the hydraulic parameterization. And if anyone wants to calculate how the total runoff of certain high mountain catchment will be, these are stuff that needs to be in that kind of modeling. Yeah. So to go specifically to what I'm doing is, my question is groundwater under permafrost conditions in the high Andes. And so for this task, my method tries to include a LAMP parameter model, which integrates chemical data, hydrochemical data, and also the hydraulic parameterization, okay? Which are things that are usually assumed from geological maps to try to understand how much water is actually flowing down and how much is storage. And so this is the diagram of what my method is. And so you see input, snow, glacier, the reservoirs that I assume to be there, and finally the outputs. And so I basically take samples from groundwater spring and try to figure out what's going on before, right? So the system inputs for the convolution integral which is the simplification of a land parameter model, will be integrated for the analysis. And finally, I will have a time expression of the range in which water can flow through the system, okay? And also we try to include some metagenomic analysis, which found some interesting microorganisms that are related to permafrost environments, but also to glacier environments. So now we need to try to discretize whether when you sample them from the groundwater spring, does it come from an infiltration from the glacier, or is it actually coming from an older water storage that in these conditions might be a permafrost environment? And so this is like one of the main results that I got now, is that using tritium for the convolution integral, you do a Monte Carlo simulation and you get a distribution of results. And in general, using stable and unstable isotopes, we can say that the groundwater stays in the system, which is in permafrost conditions around 10 and 3 plus minus years. So this is an important insight to bear in mind if we're trying to understand the evolution of these systems. And so we now go to the next part, which is kind of how do we integrate these insights into something for the public sphere. So once we have attested the changes are occurring either by shifts in variables or shifts in the parameters, then we need to look for the scale coherence to understand what landscape evolution is. So we can know from a positivist perspective, okay, water is there, water might not run off that season. And so what do we do, or how do we do the planning with this storage? And so a scale coherence is what I'm trying to figure out using a kind of an economical shortcut, using non-scale approach to values, non-use value scale, use value scale, and to integrate that in the legislation scope. And so finally, you could have integrated assessment proposals for the improvement of the environmental impact assessment. And this will try to cope with the challenge of how to legislate unknown elements, let's say, which is all that we cannot see directly, but also the processes in the long term. And here we simplify all this by saying, okay, we have our anthropocentric concern about the ecosystem provision services, but since it is related to certain landscapes that are protected sometimes, we need to derive this into the dichotomy of non-use and use values, and then to intrinsic value, but also the water storage or the water provision. And then finally, we can have some expressions to say, okay, insurance value, hydrological volumes, etc. So the excursus is, we will try to attest a threshold of importance, but this needs to be coupled with the baseline so that we can give our input to decisions that are basically decisions like recommendations for policy making, legislation, upcoming glacier law, which will include permafrost in these areas, and try to help the legislative contradictions of use versus protection, also the moral hazards, which are the conflict of interest in decision making, let's say for the expansion of mining infrastructure. And all this will go in the integrating new dimensions of water security, which is related as well with the permafrost. And so this is something that was slightly covered in some publication, but briefly, the challenge is to integrate this value dimension in the permafrost arena in the Andes and improve the impact assessments, anticipating the evolving value in the dimension of the problem. So that's all that I had to say. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sebastian. That was very interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience for Sebastian? If yes, you can just unmute yourself and ask, or you can send a question in the chat and we can read it out for you. Anybody? So I do have one question. I am not very familiar with mountain permafrost, but so you found a 10-year residence time. I'm assuming that's longer than the residence time of water from non-permafrost environments.
Yeah. Oh, I'm muted. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. In general, the problem is that you have a long tail in the results, in the distribution, and so this 10-year is something that is like the minimum. Okay. So this is what we would expect in a glaciarized environment. But since we compare tritium, you know, the recent tritium, this is how we know that it for sure must be something that got isolated or that it's related to previous events. But I always try to play with the less risky result. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. And then if nobody else has a question, I do have one more kind of on the same topic. But so as the permafrost starts to warm, I'm guessing that there will also, it's expected that there might be more hazards, like geohazard type events. Do you have any comments on that?
For me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in this problem is far more important in Peruvian and Bolivian catchments, where practically half will be gone in the next years. And so you have really big proglacial lakes there. But this problem is also very I mean, it's very important to anticipate this kind of issue now before, you know, some lakes will expand and create such risk. But exactly in the catchment where I work, you don't have this huge proglacial lake. And so the permafrost containing any of these volumes is not related to that kind of risk specifically. But in my opinion, the proglacial lake in the Andes would be at altitudes that are not compatible with permafrost occurrence as such.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And if nobody else has any questions for Sebastian. Oh,
I have one question actually. I was wondering about the fieldwork. Thank you for the interesting presentation, by the way. I was wondering about the fieldwork that you conduct there. Is that in the same region multiple times, and is there a station there, or do you just go there on singular events? Do you hike up, or?
Yeah, the problem with that protected area where I work is that you can't go in trucks and you can't go with animals to transport your stuff. So it's basically a 2-day walk. And so I try to go in December and in April. And so you can have like the freshet signal to analyze isotopes, for example, and then you need to go in April. So the ideal is obviously to go every 2 weeks, etc. But since it's a very complicated location to get to, you need to go by walk 2 days. If you don't have the chopper, you go at the beginning of the the overall melting of snow and such. And then you go in April when you see that everything is practically gone, and now you will have the upcoming raining and snowing, of course.
It sounds very challenging, but also exciting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Sebastian. And now we will move on to our last, but certainly not least speaker, who is Mishélle. And I will add her to the spotlight, and you can start sharing your screen whenever you're ready. So Mishélle will be talking to us today about rock glaciers in Alberta.
Yes. So, hello, my name is Mishélle Wehbe. I'm a Master of Science candidate at the Bonaventure Lab for Permafrost Science at the University of Lethbridge. I'm just going to talk to you today briefly about my aerial inventory of rock glacier distribution that I did in Banff, well, that's currently being done in Banff National Park in Canada. So first and foremost, for those of you that aren't really familiar with rock glaciers, what is a rock glacier? Well, rock glaciers are perennially frozen masses of ice and unconsolidated material that creep down slope as a result of internal cyclic freeze and thaw mechanisms. These features are often tongue-shaped, such as figure A, or lobate landforms, like figure B, down in figure 2. They have longitudinal or transverse flow features, which can be observed kind of right here. So these would be the lateral margins. This is what is referred to in the literature as the frontal slope or the toe. And that's the transverse and ridging. So they can be classified as intact, which contain ice, or relic fossilized features that no longer have ice present. Those two rock glaciers in figure 2, those are both intact rock glaciers. So there is ice, freeze-thaw processes still occurring. The diagram here in figure 1, that's a schematic diagram of common landscapes in alpine environments that you will see rock glaciers occur in. You can have a rock glacier coming off of a talus slope right next to a valley rock glacier. There really is no end or no unique situation that doesn't include all. Now you might be asking yourself, why does this matter? So regarding Canada, there are a limited number of studies completed, with only 2 completed within the past 5 years. Most of them are from 1999 and before. Within the Rocky Mountains region, Luckman and Crockett found over 112 rock glaciers in a small study area located in southern Jasper. Thinking about a wider scale, there are potentially thousands of these features that have yet to be discovered. Rock glaciers are very, very important as they house fresh water within their internal structures. They're important for hydrological regimes of the surrounding environments, especially in the relatively drier regions or where glaciers are disappearing. Various researchers have used rock glacier inventories in the assessment of regional water stores should climate change induce local water shortages. Rangecroft did this in 2015 in the Bolivian Andes, for example. A rock glacier inventory was created and then used to obtain protection for these landforms. That being said, their surfaces are very unstable and they can have hazardous slope stabilizations relatively quickly. So no selfies on their surfaces, please. This poses a risk to anthropogenic activities and facilities in the surrounding regions, especially within Canada, given that they are within a copious amount of national and provincial parks. So a lot of tourists frequent these regions, so knowing their distribution is crucial. As the IPA, the International Permafrost Association, has highlighted through their creation of an international scientific mapping initiative, there's a very important and pressing need for this database. This work also represents the rational evaluation of the suitability of using this method at a regional scale. Sorry, that's my cat. So that we're able to apply these methods in various alpine environments to continue our lab's mapping initiative, which I'll explain a bit more about shortly. So to develop our proof of concept, we chose Banff National Park in Alberta as our initial study area. Banff is situated on the Alberta side of the Rocky Mountains, which is along Alberta's western border with British Columbia. So this is Alberta, this is British Columbia, and this is Calgary. I'm up here in Edmonton, and the University of Lethbridge kind of down here. Just in case you want to know. It is located west of Calgary and is approximately 6,641 square kilometers of alpine terrain. Jasper National Park borders Banff to the north up here, in case you've ever heard of that national park, with Kootenay and Yoho kind of down here to the south. Using this chart in figure 5 of rock glacier geomorphic indicators as a guide, and the mandatory geomorphic criteria determined by the IPA's action group. These criteria include lateral margins, a front, and sometimes containing the ridging surface features. Those are optional criteria, but still kind of prominent. An initial inventory was completed using free high-resolution optical imagery within the Esri World Imagery base layer and Google Earth Pro. Some of the sensors used by the aforementioned include GeoEye, WorldView, and Maxar technologies, which have an amazing resolution, some as good as a couple of feet. As figure 6 shows you over here to the right, sorry, we used a grid-based mapping methodology to ensure that the study area was manually searched for features thoroughly and efficiently. Each grid cell that you see there is 5 square kilometers. Within our mapping initiative, we have 3 distinct feature layers. The first feature layer is an independent layer solely for rock glaciers. The second is for features of interest, such as embryonic rock glaciers less than 0.1 square kilometers, as identified by the IPA criteria, and those that can be hard to distinguish from protalus ramparts, or that are in need of kinematic data to fully categorize them as rock glaciers. The last layer was for delineating the grid cells that were entirely unsearchable, so either because of band gaps, glacier influences, etc., which could then be searched in Google Earth Pro. Upon completion of this initial stage of feature identification using the base layer, the shapefile was then converted into a Google Earth file and manually searched again by myself to identify features that were missed for the next crucial step. So I just want to play this little video for you guys so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Google Earth in particular uses these high resolution satellite images and projects them onto a 3D digital elevation model for you that can have its terrain over exaggerated to give more context when looking for the features, or you can pan around and manipulate it to better search these features and categorize them. Google Earth has been used in the creation of rock glacier inventories previously in the Bolivian Andes, as aforementioned, the Hindu Kush Himalayan mountains, the Italian Alps, the BC coastal mountains, and more recently by Johnson et al. And Troca in the United States. Similarly to Johnson et al. And Troca, our methodology uses Google Earth Pro alongside the World Imagery base layer. One of the nifty perks is the historical imagery tool in Google Earth Pro. This tool, as you'll see in figure 7, it allows for us to maintain our maximum snow and cloud cover of 10% because it has the historical imagery tool. So this tool allows for the user to promptly browse the images, but you can go back in time. You can find the image with the best resolution, clarity, and minimal snow and cloud cover, like I said before. And you can see the differences. So if you look at the top image, you can see a band gap and it hides that terrain and those features. So once you go back in time, you can browse all the images that they have available for that location and from various sensors as well. You can see that you're now more able to see the terrain. And the same thing for the bottom pictures as well. You can see they're all covered with snow and there's kind of like a discoloration. But then once I went back in time, I was able to better see the terrain. It's very crucial for seeing those small ones that I was talking about before, those embryonic rock glaciers, or especially if you have a rock glacier that's kind of on a valley wall that you're unable to see otherwise in a 2D image. Now, how is this methodology different, or why does it matter? Who cares? Well, there's one thing that I wanted to note in what sets our methodology apart from previous methodology done. So like I said before, there was 2 other individuals that used the World Imagery Base Layer and Google Earth Pro for the completion of their rock glacier inventories. Ours does as well. Both of those inventories were in the United States. One of them, the one by Troca in 2020, used features of interest as well. As you can see here by figure 8, these were what were classified as her features of interest. So it's worth noting that the morphological characteristics of the features of interest used in this methodology unfortunately caused smaller scale low bait rock glaciers to not be included as definitive rock glaciers, even though they met the IPA criteria. So as you can see here, to the left, that shows a feature of interest that can easily fall into the category of a protalus rampart or something worth investigating. However, if you look to the right, you can see that that feature has flow features, the lateral margins, and the front that meet the IPA criteria. And so our methodology using the features of interest delineation ensures that the features identified meet the IPA criteria and are not miscategorized. So the feature on the right would be classified as a rock glacier in our methodology, and the feature on the left would be a feature of interest. What we found so far. So we found 504 rock glaciers within Banff National Park. This number does not include the 107 features of interest that are in the process of being verified with Google Earth. Aspect was found to be a strong topographic parameter influencing the distribution of these intact rock glaciers in this region. And what does this mean? Well, the majority of the rock glaciers in southern Canadian Rocky Mountains are located in high elevation north and northeastern facing slopes. Although these findings are preliminary, it's believed that this is due to the shielding from insolation and the local topographic influences on the direction of cold winds, which allows for the cold winter air temperatures to permeate through the debris layer, which in turn sustains the negative ground temperatures required for intact rock glacier maintenance. And it's worth noting that our results do align with the previous studies conducted within this region and within the Yukon as well regarding aspect. What's next? Well, currently we're on step 3 for Banff National Park. I'm drawing the polygons and I'm classifying the rock glaciers from the surrounding terrain more quantifiably. Once this is complete, the inventory will then be draped over a 10-meter resolution digital elevation model to further quantify more geomorphometrics, such as insolation, max-min elevations, area coverage, slope, etc. The next step after this is the predictive modeling aspect. So one of our goals is to create a predictive model using the geomorphometrics from the previous step, which will be done in the adjacent national park, Jasper, to see if these variables can predict rock glacier distribution and to what certainty. Although not included in this presentation, step 6 is currently being completed in Jasper National Park by myself. The verification is essentially repeating steps 1 and 2 in Jasper manually to determine the quality of the model and verification. There's preliminary findings of over 447 rock glaciers and over 200 features of interest to be further investigated. And it's still not done. There's still more area to map, which is pretty cool, I think. There are also rock glacier inventories being completed alongside this initiative, which brings me to my next and final point. The big picture. So the Bonaventure Lab for Permafrost Science Rock Glacier Mapping Initiative. As you can see by figure hashtag, because I forgot to put the final figure number. This map depicts various regions within Canada that our lab will be applying the methods discussed within this presentation. As you can see by the darker red areas, 1, 2, and 3, those are what we call first priority. So those are ones that are being completed currently and efficiently so that we can obtain a latitudinal and longitudinal comparison of features found within these regions. Priority 2 regions, the lighter red ones, just kind of here, those regions are being completed simultaneously to the aforementioned regions as well. These regions include, but are not limited to, the Ogilvie Mountains, Dawson Range, Selkirk Mountains, St. Elias, etc. Just to give some names for the regions that people may not be unfamiliar with. Once this initiative is completed, the inventory will be shared with the International Permafrost Association as part of their rock glacier inventorying group. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Mishélle. That was very interesting. Rock glaciers aren't something that I hear about very often, and I feel like I have learned a lot. Are there any questions from the audience? Because if not, I have lots.
I also have one. Maybe it fits to one of your last slides. You said that you're going to look at the big picture. I think it's a really cool approach and really ambitious also. And how are you going to determine the priorities of the mountainous regions? What's the approach there? Is it like reachability or what's behind there?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. I'm doing number 1 currently. We have a Master of Science student that is doing number 3, and then number 2 is being done as well. I mean priority 1 in the sense of that they're currently being done right now, and then priority 2 are just kind of occurring simultaneously. But access to these regions, it does play a part to an extent.
Okay.
So it looks like we have a question from Sebastian.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the presentation. It was very nice to see rock glaciers in Canada. Just wondering about you quote the IPA working group rock glaciers. I just got confused about the classification because they update the classification talking more about active, transitional, and relict. So they got rid of inactive in the new document. If you see the last document, the guidelines.
Yes, I have the document.
Yeah, they update the categorization of activity into active, transitional, and relict.
Yes, I was just referencing their geomorphic characteristics for identification of the features. We are doing further classification based off of those as well, but for the purpose of this inventory, it was solely focusing on intact rock glaciers, those that were still containing ice, as we do plan on calculating the water storage potential within these rock glaciers.
Before going to the classification as well, are you thinking to use some optical images or insert data to see the rate of activity, so you can better distinguish between active and inactive landforms, not only seeing the geomorphology?
So once we're done classifying them, we're going to be using the world imagery base layer to impose the polygons to delineate their morphology. To further classify their kinematics, the idea is to use DINSAR to quantify their movement, if any, to also kind of further refine our methodology in distinguishing between intact, active, and inactive, because there is a big difference in the potential for water volume storage. Sometimes the intact rock glaciers that are inactive are actually losing ice. So yes, to answer your question, we will be using DINSAR or some type of kinematics to quantify that and further investigate. There's more. There's lots coming.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Are there any other questions for Mishélle? All right. Well, if we can all give a big round of virtual applause or some sort of reaction via Zoom or snapping or something to thank our 3 great speakers. I think that the first PYRN seminar that we've hosted during our ExCom has gone really well, and keep an eye out in the future for more calls to be either a speaker and also more invitations to attend the next round of talks. So thank you all very much. And this was recorded, so we will be posting the speakers' videos onto YouTube within the week for anybody you know that would like to have seen the presentations but wasn't able to make it. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Josephine. You too.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.